Hi, it's Writing Wednesday. I'm sitting in my car, which is parked on Harbor Drive in St. John's for reasons which will soon become apparent. I'm here today with someone else's book, although this is not an addendum to this month's book review vlog, which you certainly should go and watch. Rather, I want to talk about historical fiction and what boundaries writers set for themselves as to what they will and won't do in terms of playing around with history. And there isn't a better book to illustrate that than Wayne Johnson's The Colony of Unrequited Dreams, a book which I both loved and was infuriated by. So for anyone who doesn't know it, Johnson's book, which is probably one of the best and most highly acclaimed Newfoundland novels of our generation, is sort of a fictional biography of Joey Smallwood, Newfoundland's first premier and probably one of our most towering historical figures. And in it, Johnson very freely makes up and invents characters and events and things that never happened. One of the key characters in the novel is a wholly fictional character, Sheila Fielding, who has no sort of basis in any real-life individual. I mean, this is something I think about constantly as a writer of historical fiction. My personal rule of thumb is never to contradict a known historical fact if I can help it. So I write a lot of things that didn't happen, but I always try to write them in such a way that they could have happened. That as if I'm creating a real historical landscape and then trying to drop fictional characters and events down into it, but to make the landscape itself as accurate as possible. Colony of Unrequited Dreams, Wayne Johnson takes a very different approach. The novel is in itself an exploration of historical storytelling, who gets to tell the stories of history, who gets to say what's true and what's not. There are egregious anachronisms in this book. I think everybody who's ever read it, at least anyone who knows Newfoundland at all, is well aware of that. And I think they pretty much have to be deliberate. And I think partly because he wants to play with this whole idea of historicity and, you know, what is a true story. So one thing about this book has bothered me for years and years, ever since I first read it. He's telling the story of one of Newfoundland's most famous disasters, the sealing disaster of 1914, except that he sets it in 1916. I can sort of see getting away with that. I wouldn't do it myself. For example, it would be much, much better for my story if women in Newfoundland had earned the right to vote in 1922 or 1923 instead of 1925 as they actually did. It's not a huge change, and I suppose I could make it because it would fit my plot better, but I wouldn't. So Johnson sets the sealing disaster in 1916 instead of 1914. He puts his character, Joey Smallwood, at the ice during the seal hunt that year, which he certainly was not. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that degree of fiddling with history. Here's the part that makes me crazy. He describes the scene as the ships return from that ill-fated sealing journey with a dead man on board, and describes how many people have come out to see the ships come in. It looked as if the entire population of the island, ordered to evacuate, were awaiting the arrival of some massive ship. They had come ill-dressed from their row houses on the heights, down hills so steep that even when the ground was bare you could hardly keep from running. Great description and great evocation of the way downtown St. John's is laid out. They had come well-dressed from the valley sides and from the homes along the city streams, and in leather aprons and overalls from the factories of Water Street and the cod-crammed stores of Harbor Drive. This is where we start having a problem. I start having a problem. There were so many people that some could get no closer to the harbor than the coves, the little streets that from Water Street led down to the apron. Just to orient you a little bit to what's being described, I'm currently driving down Harbor Drive with the city of St. John's on my left and St. John's Harbor on my right. Off to the left, past the brick and glass monstrosity of Atlantic Place and its parking garage, are a number of little short streets that connect Harbor Drive to the main business street, Water Street. These streets are called coves. The particular one that I'm turning up right now is called Cliff's Baird's Cove. I can only assume that the Cliffs and the Bairds had an argument over who got to name the cove. But anyway, these tiny little streets connect Harbor Drive and the harbor to the main business part of downtown St. John's, which is Water Street. So driving down Harbor Drive again, this time in the opposite direction, this is how downtown St. John's is laid out today. It most emphatically is not how it was laid out in 1916 when that scene that Wayne Johnson wrote is set. I don't know why it makes me crazy that Wayne Johnson can invent characters and move historical events around without troubling me at all, and yet when he puts Harbor Drive running down here along the city's waterfront in 1916, when everybody living in St. John's today over the age of 40 knows that Harbor Drive was not put through until at least the 1960s. I'd have to check the exact date, but I definitely would check it if I were writing a book about downtown St. John's. We certainly know that there was no street running along the harbor front, and those little coves that he describes as streets, which they are now, in 1916 when he's setting that scene, were actual coves. Water Street was the downtown street. The piers from the various Water Street businesses reached out into the harbor like fingers, and in between those piers were the coves. Why does this matter? Maybe it doesn't. It's still a vivid and evocative scene, but it jars with me, and it would to anybody who knows St. John's, that it's a vivid and evocative scene placed on a street that did not exist at that time. Now, obviously, I'm not here to critique Wayne Johnson. He wrote a brilliant book, one that is and deserves to be a classic of Newfoundland literature. But it definitely does pry open the question of how faithful does the historical novelist have to be to historical fact, and that includes details of geography. I am really, really obsessive about trying to get those things right, probably too obsessive. And of course, the great irony of it is that you can be as obsessive as I am about researching and looking at old maps and old photographs and trying to get the street exactly as it would have been at that time, and still make howling errors and anachronisms. But clearly this is something that historical novelists have different opinions about, and I'm sure readers of historical fiction do too. I would love to know in comments what you think about this, how much an anachronism bothers you when you're reading a historical novel, or does it bother you at all? Are you only concerned about telling a good story? Let me know.